Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us live from NC State University. I'm Lauren Mattern, Sales and Marketing Manager of the Dayhuff Group, a premier IBM business partner. We're excited to be here today with Dr. Kowolenko in our partnership with IBM, Lighthouse, and NC State. Just a few housekeeping items real quick. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end. It's going to be moderated by Bob Sylvester from IBM, so feel free to type in your questions as the presentation goes along. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, and if we don't, we'll be sure to send out a follow-up note. Without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Michael Kowolenko.
Good morning, everybody. What I'd like to do today is go over some of the topics that have come up with regard to cognitive computing, in particular how they could apply to the pharmaceutical industry. I come at this from somewhat of a personal angle, as I've spent about 23 years in the pharmaceutical industry, and I often struggled with trying to understand how we were using the data we collected throughout the development of a drug to its commercialization, how you manufacture the compound, what you have to do from a compliance point of view, and how to bring those pieces of data together in order to make an intelligent decision. Oftentimes I was frustrated because we would spend lots and lots of money on different systems, and what we did was ended up aggregating information instead of using it to do sense-making and decision-making. So what I'd like to do today is go over some of the tools and techniques that we've deployed in different pharma organizations to help them with this problem. And many of the concepts are based on this idea about cognitive computing. So if we go to the next slide. Next slide. There we go. A little bit about my background and why maybe you should listen to me. As I said, I did spend about 23 years in the industry, and I worked in areas that encompassed the research organizations. I worked in preclinical, so we did a lot of toxicology studies and dealt with GLP. Moved into the idea of quality and dealt a lot with compliance issues. And several of the companies I dealt with had different issues associated with drug manufacture, how you release compounds, those sorts of things. So I was exposed to a lot of the issues that show up in different parts of the drug development and commercialization cycle. Now, I did this, and what I saw was, as I moved from company to company, as my kids said, I had trouble holding a job, I guess, was that there were common themes that developed with regard to how people handled information and what the perceived expectations were from the agency and how the companies, handled different questions or topics that came up. Now, in many of my interactions with these agencies, what I came to understand was that as long as we were the experts and we understood what we were doing and had a clear scientific rationale behind what we were presenting, then generally we could get the agency to go along with our plans. You know, at the end, like the slide says, I was at Wyeth just prior to the merger with, or acquisition by Pfizer. And when Pfizer came in, I decided to really focus on this problem of integrating data and figuring out how to build better systems. And that's what led me over here to NC State, where I'm now the director of the Institute of Next Generation Computing. So if we go to the next slide. So what is the Institute of Next Generation Computing? This is where I have to do my propaganda speech. What we are is a group that works within the university to help companies, organizations, understand how to use data. We develop the infrastructure, that is, what's the hardware that you need, what are the types of switches that you need, how do all these things work together with storage in order to provide a solution that allows you to look at data and develop new ways of applying that data to business problems. So what we do is an end-to-end assessment of helping companies go from this technical development to commercialization. Now, people say, well, being a state university, why do you do this? How do you do this? Remember, we're a land-grant university, and our charter is to help organizations become better, to strive to improve their business acuity and capability. And we view this as a way of us helping the community to understand the potential of these types of systems. It also helps that we're able to bring companies in and at a very low cost, show them how to develop these systems. They avoid the cost of building out an infrastructure or looking at different types of software packages, those sorts of things, because we often work in partnership with different organizations such as DAHOF or Lighthouse and IBM to show them how these solutions can be applied to different businesses. So we view it as a win-win situation. We get to show companies how to be better. We bring students in, they understand how to work with these systems, and then students often transfer to the companies that they do projects with. So let's talk a little bit about what this cognitive computing thing, and to tell you the truth, I struggled with this when I first became involved in IT. And the reason for that is my background. Well, you know, my doctorate's in immunology and I did a postdoc in biochemistry, but I actually have degrees in pharmacy and neuropharmacology as well. So it became difficult for me to understand, well, what do they mean by cognition? If I think about it from what the brain does, machines can't do that. But if we think about it in a different way, in the sense that what cognitive computing is to say, I can take inputs from different sources and try to make sense out of them. So just like the brain does that when it takes, you know, what you've seen, what you've remembered, your past experience, and comes up with a new way or a new idea, machines are going to do this in a somewhat different manner. They're going to take inputs that have been programmed into them, but each one is going to be dependent upon those systems that captured the data. So you can look at cognitive computing as capturing information that can come from a database, it can come from unstructured text, it can come from your cell phone, all sorts of information is out there. What we have to do in cognitive computing is figure out how to put it all together to give us a good way of answering a question or solving a problem. So if we think about it from that point of view, what we're doing is we're looking at all these different types of inputs, the way the data is aggregated, then applying different sets of algorithms to it in order to make sense out of that information. So again, this gets to the sense-making part. Now, the memory is something where you start thinking about, well, am I talking about the memory of the hardware? Am I talking about the ability to recall? Think of it more in the terms of, as I gain experience in a system, what I can then do is build different types of models around that experience and extract information based on that experience. So we can start to see these parallels with regard to what the human does when it goes through a cognitive process and what we're talking about with machines. So the bottom line here is when I'm talking about cognitive computing in this context, I'm talking about bringing in different types of input, different types of data, and then organizing it in a way that makes sense in order to make a business decision. So hopefully, you know, it took me a while to understand and to make that transition. And hopefully people are a little bit clearer now about what we mean by that in this environment. So the other thing to remember with regard to machines, and I like to joke about this, a lot of people talk about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is the same thing that gives you autocorrect. So if you're afraid that machines are going to take over the world, worry about them getting autocorrect right first, okay? Autocorrect it's a statistically based way of analyzing what you're typing and determining what that word should be. What does autocorrect suffer from? It doesn't understand specificity and context that well. That's what humans do really well, and that's what we have to teach machines to do better, is understand how to do that specificity and context. Humans are really good at ambiguity. They're good at trying to figure out problems. And if you think about it in the context of a mystery versus a puzzle, humans are very good at mysteries. And why is that? Mystery is open-ended. It can be ambiguous about how things are going to end. Puzzles, on the other hand, have distinct boundaries, and they have to play within those boundaries. Machines are good at puzzles. Machines are not good at mysteries. Okay? So if you think about it, a machine can go there and play a game of Go or can play chess because there are defined rules and parameters by which the machine must play. You don't have to program in every specific aspect of it. We can do fuzzy programming that allows us to work within a constraint, but we can't tell the machine to violate the rules. Humans, on the other hand, are really good at violating rules, hence why we have a lot of compliance issues. But on the other hand, they also allow us to make jumps in logic. What we try to do is to get people to take their ambiguous thoughts and turn them into unambiguous statements that the machine can then help them retrieve data around. So the idea here is the more specific you can be in asking your question, the better the machine's going to be at coming forward and providing you with the data that you're going to need to answer your question, all right? So we can take advantage of that. And what we want to do is leverage each one of these aspects of the human and the machine so that each plays to its strength. And that's what we're doing when we're developing these systems. Okay, now what I did here is look at some of the terms that people are coming up with and I'll be referring back to these as we go through the rest of this presentation. The idea about what machine learning is and the concepts behind the analysis. Basically, if we're doing a classification, that's a yes or no question. If you give me a series of parameters or attributes of something, I could say whether or not a particular model or a drug fits those attributes and should be labeled in, let's say, a specific class. Or let's say I see a series of different activities that occur on the manufacturing floor. Can I say that they're compliant or non-compliant? What I've done is ask the machine to look at certain attributes or characteristics and say, yes, those exist, they are present, or no, they're not. Regression is just a way of taking that data and being predictive about it. So as we start to think about what the machine's going to do, the machine is going to look at all these different attributes and then go through a process of trying to get to what we call homogeneity. That is, can we isolate a series of attributes so that they specifically represent one unit within the data? Many times we can do that. Other times, depending upon the degree of ambiguity, we may not. So in all of those things, what we're really trying to do is understand whether or not data can be classified. And then once it's classified, can I use it for decision? Right? Now, the machine's going to do statistical things with regard to prioritization. That is, remember, it's going to homogeneity. But the human, on the other hand, may decide certain things are more important than others. And those are when we start talking about a way of treating the data in a weight order decision process or some other statistical methodology. The difference between what the machine's doing in a machine learning context and what the person's doing in a weight order decision process is the machine is going to homogeneity. It doesn't have a prioritization other than to try to get to a unique principle or a unique product, while the machine being programmed by man for decision making may say certain aspects are more important than others, such as, if I have an issue with sterility in aseptic processing, that poses a higher risk than looking at an issue in a tablet press. Why? Because the risk on public health is greater with a sterile injection than it is with a tablet. So in that sort of prioritization, man has made that decision. The machine is then programmed to reflect that decision. Unstructured text analytics, which I'll talk about, is the combination of natural language processing with both rules-based systems and statistically based systems. And I'll be referring to that a little bit. The idea here is, remember, in a rules-based system, we can put specificity and context in. The statistical system is autocorrect, and we've already seen what that can do to people. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. All right, now, when I first got into pharma, everyone told me what I couldn't do. That seemed to be the general aspect of things that, we're so regulated, we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't. Well, to tell you the truth, if you start taking apart the CFRs, you can understand what the regulations are trying to do. And that is to have you operate in a state of control. To me, that's good business. If you can operate in a state of control, then you know where your problems are and you can be proactive about how you want to address those problems. Now, oftentimes people who say you can't or you shouldn't or whatever haven't really looked at the regulations to understand what the requirements are. So as you start to think about how you can design new systems to extract data, always go back and understand what the requirements are. Now, the next thing is that by understanding and being very compliant, you actually have a strategic advantage in your operation. Remember, they are current good manufacturing or good XP criteria. If you can raise the bar, what you've done now is you've told the competition they have to catch up to you. I still go back to the underlying principle, though, that compliance is good control. And as anyone in operations would tell you, control is of the utmost importance in getting product out the door. Remember, it's not how much product you produce, it's how much you can release that really matters to the organization. And as far as the authorities are concerned, what they really want to do is to make sure that you know what you're doing. Remember, you should know more about the product that you're producing, the clinical trial that you're running, the lab tests that you're using than they do. You're supposed to be able to inform them. If you can't do that, you have bigger issues, to tell you the truth. But what you can do with data now and our ability to do cognitive platforms is to bring much more of that data together in order to make a much more coherent argument behind the science and rationale behind why you're starting to execute the plans the way you are, why you're implementing an assay the way you are, why you've decided to release a product the way you did. So it all comes down to now, if I start thinking about this cognitive platform, I can bring in many more inputs, and the machine is never going to get tired, and it's never going to take a break, and it's always going to collect the data for you. And now you can ask better questions and put that information together in a much more coherent way to make a better argument to the agency. Next slide. Part 11. In the 20 years of doing pharma, I've seen about, I don't know how many different ways of people understanding Part 11. What I've done here is I've put down what it actually says. Now again, in looking at the systems that we're developing, some of them may require Part 11, depending upon how you're doing it. What are you using these systems for? How are you bringing them into your decision-making process with regard to releasing a product or evaluating a clinical trial, looking at data robustness, all of those sorts of things. Again, I view it as not an excuse to not do something, but rather figure out how can I approach this problem of Part 11 and demonstrate that I can run in a series, I can run in control. And again, you don't have to do everything all at once. You can do a progressive rollout of different aspects of cognitive computing as you gain better understanding of what it's doing. And you can always run systems in parallel as well. Again, the agency is there to help you with these sorts of things and can comment on your approach. But you have to present to them what you want to do. They're not going to tell you what to do. So I view this as a way of understanding control, again, in your systems. Okay, the data systems, again, they also offer this opportunity from Part 11 to handle questions with regard to data integrity. And if you look at some of the 483 observations that are coming up around data integrity, if you start looking more at your log books and your records and the way machines are printing out their information, it really can give you a heads up on whether or not you have a data integrity issue happening within your organization. It becomes very transparent when people manipulate timestamps, things like that. So in that aspect, I would say that many organizations, with pharma, you have to have more people who start to understand data flow and this whole idea of where data is kept, how it's kept, and the different tags or meta information that's associated with different files. If you have that under control, then your ability to predict whether or not you're going to have a data integrity issue actually goes up. And you can, again, demonstrate to an agency, if you have these systems in place, why that shouldn't be a concern for them or for you. Next slide. All right, so let's get down to the bottom line with data models, and what you're trying to do at the end of the day is make a decision. And what we have generally are two different types of data that we deal with. The first is what most people are familiar with, and that's quantitative information that you collect in a typical database. We could talk about QC, where the laboratory data, the outputs, are in a very structured format. You get nice numeric information that comes out of it. Batch production records can be the same sort of thing where I'm recording different values or steps versus a descriptive analytic. And a descriptive analytic is when we start talking about text and understanding what people are saying about something. So if we think about it from a quantitative view, it's how, what, when, where. And we start talking descriptive, it's why. And it's bringing those two things together that allows you to make a better decision. And when you start thinking about what's happening from a compliance point of view, if I start looking at things like my descriptions of deviations, can I find trends in those deviations by what people write? And this is, again, where cognitive computing can help. I can write a series of rules that go out and extract that information from my deviations. I could then take that information and plot it against what the FDA is citing on their website. And we'll get into a couple screenshots where we've done those sorts of things. The analysis comes up, and at the end of the day, it's the decision. And many times, this is where the quality organization comes into play, because they're making a decision about whether or not a product can be released. If we're talking in a clinical trial, again, it's understanding those pieces of information and whether or not the appropriate pieces of data exist that allow you to determine whether or not the protocol was followed, the patients were monitored appropriately, and the correct decisions were made. And again, in a clinical trial, you're often talking about a combination of both structured and unstructured data. The stuff that goes into the database that, if you look at something like what SAS produces for all of its information in monitoring and clinical trial versus what the descriptions are regarding the patient records, the EMRs, those sorts of things that are an unstructured text analytics problem. And it's in bringing those two together, another type of cognition that allows you to make better decisions. Next slide. All right, so what's this? This is a cognitive compute platform. You could sit there and go, my God, what is, you don't expect us to do that. No, this is what your backroom, your data people do. But this is the sort of system we're talking about having organizations put in place to do this type of cognitive computing. When I work with different pharma companies, the idea here is to get them to understand they have all sorts of different pieces of data that they can bring in. And what they want to do is come into this common repository that allows us to then analyze those pieces of information. Now, if you think about, if anyone's on the webinar that is from the IT organizations, this in effect is sort of like a data lake environment. But when we start talking about analytics, what we're really doing is bringing things into a temporary holding location to do the analytic and then to flush the information when it's done. It's a very specific purpose-built system. And it's to do these types of analytics, to bring in all these different inputs. That way it doesn't affect the normal day-to-day operations of other pieces of your IT infrastructure. It just takes pieces from that. All right, it allows the transient transfer of data into the system in order to do its compute. When I talk about those things in the pink, those are just different types of data structures that we use to do different types of analytics. Almost everyone is familiar with structured databases in SQL. Some of the other tools there refer to new ways of presenting information and looking at relationships. If you think about Facebook and how it shows connections between people, well, imagine we can do the same thing between different types of drugs. Let's say I have one pharmacologic class, kinase inhibitors. Well, I could show different attributes of kinase inhibitors and see how they interact with other types of phosphorylation type agents and determine those sorts of relationships, much like you do in Facebook. Those are things that are done in a graph database. Okay? Then the ability to take that information and represent it or present it to people in a very straightforward fashion on a web portal is actually kind of straightforward. Once we do the analytic, you're able to place it into a structure that allows you to queue it up and look for answers right on your smartphone if you want to. It's sort of, I'd call it the curse of the iPhone. Everyone expects an app when you develop these analytical tools, and that's what we have to strive for. And truthfully, the challenge in doing analytics is to get a display or a way for people to interact with the data that can be done in a straightforward manner and isn't confusing. Not everybody's a data scientist, so how do you get that idea across? In the next slide. Now, we do have a tool that we use with many organizations to get them focused on how to do this cognitive computing. And frankly, I use this sort of like a bait and switch with organizations in the sense that it really is nothing more than the Socratic method. But if I was to go into an organization and tell them I'm teaching them how to do critical thinking and problem solving, they tell me they know how to do that sort of thing. If I tell them I'm going to work on big data, that they want to hear. Truthfully, in order to start doing some of these data applications, you have to understand the question that you're asking and the problem type that you're trying to solve. It goes back to that original statement I made about ambiguity and having no ambiguity. You have to go from ambiguous to unambiguous, and that's what this process represents. And it basically says, let's bring all those things together, let's understand the questions we're asking, and then we can gear the compute to go out and pull up those pieces of information and determine whether or not we have a problem or don't have a problem. Now, this is also an iterative process. It's not one and done, but as you gain more insight and understand what's happening in your system, you often have to go back and revisit those things and see what you have to tune, what you have to change. So, you take an example, a cognitive example of, let's say, I want to understand what's going on with my patient complaint logs. Well, you may make an assumption about what you think those complaints are and develop an extraction system that goes and reads all the documentation that's come in through your call center. And as you look at that information and apply different types of machine learning, remember I said it's trying to put it into homogeneous bundles, you may have identified 3 bundles, but there may be 2 others that you haven't identified. And that's where machine learning helps you. So again, in this case, we're talking about looking at what's coming into a call center or looking at adverse events files, those sorts of things that are highly textual that we can come in and evaluate. If you're setting up a system that says, look, I want to understand how the patients perceive my product after a launch or something like that, now we're talking about sentiment analysis. And again, those sorts of things are built into this cognitive model. And truthfully, one of the products that I'll show some screenshots from, this WEX Content Analytics, does all these sorts of things for you. The tools are built into it, or it's pretty straightforward to configure to allow you to do these sorts of things. Hence why we use it and show other companies how to try to extract information from unstructured text. And the next slide. What I've done here is to give you an example of all the different data sets that I could get out of the batch release process if I'm in manufacturing. Everything from the historian that's capturing data, if I've got an environmental monitoring system, it's producing data. I've got the deviations that are going on. I used to joke I would love to actually have a batch that was produced with no deviations, but humans being what they are, that's going to happen. Bottom line here is there's a heck of a lot of data that you have to bring together in order to release a batch of product. Now, I can do this by having someone go through and check everything manually, or perhaps I can design systems that allow me to extract the important pieces of information and present it to my quality person so that they can make a decision. What we're trying to do here is separate the activity of collation and aggregation from that of sense-making and decision-making. Because we want the human to make the decision, but let's use the machine to help us bring everything together. Therefore, in an investigation, it becomes much easier if I'm running a cognitive platform to bring these pieces of data together. Now I can focus on what the problem is and my corrective actions, rather than worrying about scrambling and do I have all the pieces of information I need in order to make the decision. So again, ripe for opportunity for me. And again, if I was back in the pharma world, I'd be doing a heck of a lot more in this end. And hopefully companies, and there are a few that are starting to address this and use these sorts of technologies. The next slide. And so as I go back to the principles of control, what we want to be able to do in this system is to be able to use different types of tooling that demonstrate control. And one that people come up with and ask us a lot to deal with is unstructured text analytics. A lot of people are familiar with using structured information and what the tooling of in product, the SAS quantitative tools and the types of toolboxes you can use for clinical trials. Not many people deal in unstructured text analytics because they're under the perception that it's kind of difficult to do. Well, it's gotten much easier over the past few years. And again, I go back to the tooling that I mentioned earlier with WEX and the fact that they provide you nice little toolboxes to develop your own sets of rules. And when you do that, now you can start getting specificity and context and applying those with your quantitative data. Remember, I said it's both the descriptive and the quantitative together that gives you a better decision. And what you're able to do now, if you bring all that together and have a wider aperture because the machine can take more in, is you can be more proactive. And again, I view that as a strategic advantage. So let's talk a bit about natural language processing and unstructured text analytics and what it really is. It's the idea that, language follows rules. Side thing, my mother was an English teacher, and when I first started doing biology, I told her I was going to delete the liberal arts gene. She didn't find that amusing. But on the other hand, now I'm sitting here after retiring and going back to academia, talking about parsing sentences and nouns and verbs and prepositional phrases and such. So I guess she has the last laugh. So thinking about what we're doing is following those rules of grammar, and we have different packages that have been designed that know what the languages are. They can read the text, the characters, and see by a certain sequence what the language is. We know about grammar, though, sometimes I'll make a joke about being in the South. We struggle with that. Parsing is that ability to take and look at all these tokens and figure out what they are. Now, what we're able to do, we've done this statistical approach for a long time. That is looking at a bag of words and saying, well, if so many terms show up, then they must be important. Well, what we like is a rules-based system where we say, well, those terms have to be in context with other terms to demonstrate a relationship. If all of those things occur together, then that means it's something important. And that's what we call a rules-based system. So if I take a series of the statistics that I see for the number of events that occur in, let's say, a clean room, and I run the text extraction against it, do I see the same sorts of issues coming up? So I can now associate the terms that were used to describe what happened with the actual counts that occurred within that piece of the facility. So I can do all sorts of different combinations. And the nice thing about it is, depending upon whether you're working in a clinical trial or in medical affairs or in regulatory, you'll combine your terms in the ways that make sense for you. And that's what you want to see in this sort of tooling, that you can bring it together and use it to answer your questions. Now, the nice thing about developing these rules-based systems is that they're recyclable. That is, you can use them over and over and over again and share them amongst your friends, so to speak. So the platform is very flexible in that way, and the specificity is determined by the user and how he or she constructs those rules and brings those terms together. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about dictionaries and looking at rules. Nouns and verbs are good because let's say I want to understand, let's go to drug development, and I'm talking about a kinase, and I say, okay, I've got terms for all the kinases, but I don't know what the end effect may be. I can take all the kinases, I could take a series of verbs that say increase, decrease, or whatever, and then I can ask it to show me the next noun that occurs in a sentence or a paragraph. And what that can do is that can infer that relationship to me and allow me to extract information that I don't need a specific dictionary for, but rather because I've asked for this noun and this verb, it gives me the specificity and context I think I need. So now we're starting to make use of parts of speech in order to be able to do those sorts of extractions. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. These are some of the headlines that I get and I use with my students to get them to understand how they have to develop unstructured text rules. And it shows the challenges of a machine versus a person and being able to make logic leaps, right? If a teacher hits idle kids nowadays, depending upon where you are, that could be a good or a bad thing. But again, how would you tell a machine to know that you're talking about a work action rather than physically beating someone? So these are the sorts of exercises you need to go through in order to develop a good unstructured text analytics program so that you get the specificity and context behind the return. Remember, garbage in is garbage out. Next slide. What I'd like to do now is give you a couple of screenshots, and this is again from Watson's Content Analytics. And what this is a representation of data that was obtained from the FDA's website on recalls. What happened is we went out there and we captured all the recall data, unstructured text, had developed a series of dictionaries around different terms within that related to quality and issues with systems control, all of the quality attributes, those sorts of things, to determine where the issues were. And as you can see, what was happening is lack of assurance of sterility. Now, again, I'm going to go back to the example I said earlier about looking at machine learning versus a weight-ordered process. Remember that the agency also uses a weight-order process. They're most concerned with aseptic processing because, again, greatest risk. If I look at the inspection results, or the recalls, again, it's a lack of sterility assurance. So basically the system, there's no surprise here. What's nice though is that the system can go out and extract all these different pieces of information. So it now gives me an understanding of where the agency is putting their focus when it comes to recalls. Not surprising, but the nice part about it is the machine went and did all this. I didn't have to go do it. I didn't have to extract the information. It's there, I can see it. Okay, go to the next one. This case, it's the same sort of analysis, and it's focused on warning letters. So if I go in and I read all the warning letters from a company, I can again break it down into all different types of classes. In this case, what I'm doing is just looking at dosage forms and the types of QC terms that we expect to show up in a warning letter. Again, you can see where they're having issues with content uniformity regardless of the dosage form. Again, these change. We can look at all different types of relationships. The important thing to take away from here is that we designed the rules to allow us to extract what we thought was important. We went to the agency's website, we took in their data, all right, their unstructured text, and did that sort of analysis. Wherever there's text, my comment is, if you see it on a screen, you can do the type of analytic that we're talking about. All right, so it's a very powerful tool. It won't get tired. It can read a lot of pages. I mean, it's not unusual for us to deal with 10 million pages of documentation and doing that sort of assessment. So you can start to see the potential here in what we're trying to do if I'm talking about it from a quality point of view in batch release. But the same thing's going to occur if I'm doing clinical trials, if I'm doing assessment of medical information, that sort of thing. So if we go to the next slide, this is something that looks at the medical literature. And in this case, what we've done is we've downloaded all of the PubMed articles associated with a certain condition. And now we're looking at different types of immune function testing and how it relates to biomarkers. Same platform, same tooling, but now a new application. So again, you see the flexibility of being able to develop your own tools in order to do the extractions around the points you think are of interest. Okay? Now, the other piece that comes up a lot of times is what sort of infrastructure do you need? Because everybody says, I'm going to go to the cloud. Well, going to the cloud, saying you're going to the cloud is sort of like saying, I'm going to drive a car. There are millions of types of cars out there with different characteristics. There are millions of clouds out there with different characteristics. What you have to determine is whether or not those attributes fit what you want to do. I'll tell you that we've struggled here when we've tried to push certain things up into the cloud, particularly with unstructured text analytics in the volumes that we're talking about. we found that it was much better to develop a system that we had in-house that could act as this transient analytics platform that we could bring data in and out of. It offered us much more flexibility. And at the end of the day, that's what we really wanted. The idea here is that this system doesn't sit here and provide, unlimited, ERP type activities. It's purpose built, as I said before, to do analytics across a broad array of data that's coming in. It's the true cognitive platform. What determines how big that system is basically how fast do you need an answer, because that's going to determine how much compute you need. If it's right away, instantaneous, like when you swipe your credit card in at a gas pump, it's not really what we're looking for. We're monitoring processes, we're monitoring our performance over time, so that urgency isn't as necessary as we would if I were doing fraud detection. If I was doing fraud detection, I'd be working on a different type of system, okay? So again, you go back to that. So what makes it successful when you try to bring one of these systems in? Well, the first thing is senior management has to support what you're doing. We often find people can get very excited about using these sorts of tools, but when you bring it to management, they're somewhat neutral about it or don't want to invest in another type of tool. That generally it's a problem, but what you have to also understand is when you're presenting this type of tooling to a group, you want to make sure that you understand that this can be applied across a business. It's not specific for one end of it. Although today we're talking about quality, as I said before, I can push it into many different aspects of it. But more importantly, does senior management want to have a better handle on their data? That to me is the real question. And if you want to move forward, that's what you want to do. You got to have the critical thinking skills. Again, you got to be able to tell the machine what to do. It's not like the magic 8-ball where you shake it and hopefully you get an answer. All right, you got to do your critical thinking and understand the question. Right? And I talked a little bit about the infrastructure as well. And in these systems, there's a very high demand on I/O, and that's truthfully why we end up with issues depending if you want to push it out into some sort of service organization. So anyway, these are the things that we've seen as we've introduced these sorts of platforms to different work environments, and that's irrespective of whether it's pharma or finance or the government. The problems or the issues have been common throughout. The vertical didn't matter. So go to the last slide, I believe. In closing, what I'd like to say is that what the power of these systems is in your ability to generate a filter that allows you to get the appropriate data, the specificity and context you need in order to address the problem statement. If you have those sorts of things, the machine can really help you out. You, at the end of the day, still have to make the decision, but the machine can really enable you to make a better decision. So I'd be happy to answer any questions now.
Since if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box. We have our moderator, Bob Sylvester from IBM, that will be happy to give the questions for Michael to answer.
So Michael, the first question that came in is, how can cognitive computing be applied to inspection preparation?
Well, again, I think if you sit there and you start thinking about, I showed you where the 483s are, where the warning letters are on the FDA website, how we did an extraction there. You then take that data and compare it to what's coming out of, let's say, your TrackWise system. And if you're using TrackWise, you can get a CSV file out of it that talks about all of your different deviations. By running the same dictionaries that you use to extract information on the 483s or the warning letters against your deviations, now you can see where you can have elements of risk show up. If the two correlate, then you know that you can expect to be asked questions about it, and you can start to prepare your responses.
All right, perfect, thanks. Can these systems be used for research activities also?
Yeah, I think so. I mentioned a couple times about using the kinase examples or whatever. If you can get that information, especially when you start talking about publications and trying to keep track of publications, you can design systems that push out information that's tailored to a given individual. If you think about services like Factiva, well, you can do that for research, but you can develop much better filters and much better ways of extracting that information and pushing it out to the different research person. And it also can show different opportunities. If you start thinking about different databases, and if I take the genomics database and I put it up against the protein database, and I can start developing relationships between like things with common attributes, think Facebook again, perhaps I can expose new areas of interest, therapeutic interest.
All right, thanks for that. Another question we got was, are cognitive computing initiatives normally based on quantitative or qualitative business cases?
Most of the time, unfortunately, it's quantitative, I think. I think they're missing the boat by not bringing in the qualitative stuff, because that's what people really struggle with. That's where you to me, you waste a lot of time where machines could help you out, okay? Quantitative, yeah, it's easier, to tell you the truth. It's all set up. I've got set templates. I can run the analytics. You know, with the qualitative stuff, you got to build those models. But, you know, as I say, there's a high alpha phase as you build them, but many of the models are recyclable, so you can reach a steady state. And again, you got a couple of people in an organization who can develop models. They can pretty much service the entire organization.
All right, thanks. The last question I see right now is, can these type of systems look at social media?
Oh, absolutely. There are different APIs that you can build on this to capture information. Many of the you know, if I'm looking at Twitter, I can pull information from their APIs. And again, now it's just an exercise in unstructured text analytics. One of the tools within WEX is they do have a sentiment analysis tool that basically you'd feed the tweets into or whatever and run the text, the sentiment analysis, and it'll score everything for you. You can tune that any way you want. But again, if you can see it on the screen, this sort of tooling will allow you to do that type of analytic.
Good. Have you had success, Michael, with signal detection using this kind of method?
What type of signal? Okay.
Generalized, because it doesn't
Okay. Yes, because again, what happens is, as I start to think about the attributes of a given product, and I'll go into the diagnostics. If I'm looking at a patient population and I have a series of attributes associated with that population using machine learning, I've then seen where I can isolate what I would say is that unexpected attribute. That is, all of a sudden something isolated out, and now it gives me yet another parameter to evaluate when I'm looking at that patient. So yes, we have done those sorts of things, and yes, we've seen it.
All right, great. And a last question I see so far, and we'll see if there's any more, but can you integrate other software systems or in-house databases into a cognitive system?
Oh, absolutely. If you can, basically, if you can get output out of those systems, you can ingest it in, at least with the WEX platform, into that system. Again, it's a pretty straightforward process that allows you to go in and read those files and to provide your analytic on it. Now, there's other tooling available. Let's say if you have disparate databases, you know, if you go with an H-based system, you can deconvolute or disambiguate those sorts of systems. So there's stepwise ways of doing that. And basically, when we talk about a platform, a cognitive platform, we're talking about putting in those sorts of tooling as well, not just the text analytics things. Okay?
All right. There's one more question that came in, Michael, and this is an interesting one. How would you approach problems in a data set that happen very rarely but are really high risk?
Oh yeah, the black swan event. The question becomes one of, if I look at those sorts of attributes, you know, I've screened and I've extracted data based on what I thought was important. Then I run the machine and it tells me something else is important. This is again where I'm going to go back to the human and say they're the ones who can make these logic jumps without having definitive programming in. I guess what I would have to do is go back and see, are there other things I can extract and other tools that I can use to try to glean more information around that discrete data point. Okay, and that's, again, it's an iterative process, as I said earlier.
Can you give us a couple ideas of use cases that you've actually addressed with this kind of system?
Well, a couple of them in dealing with the pharma companies. One is right now working very actively in the quality end of things, and in looking at how to be better prepared and how to be proactive on inspections. We've dealt with regulatory agencies in understanding where fraud could be committed with regard to annual reports and SEC filings. What's the matter? Oh. So they distracted me here, folks. Sorry. So anyway, we've done a number of things, a number of use cases. There's a paper out that Steve Markham and I put out that talks about how this was used at Kelly Services to identify new areas of activity for their business. So again, you can see where it goes, anywhere from a strategic decision to understanding what's happening in a compliance world. Okay?
All right, good.
Well, on behalf of DayHuff and Lighthouse, I want to thank you, Michael, for your time today. We did record this session, so we'll be able to reproduce this here shortly. So I'll be sure to send that out to the attendees so that you can share it and revisit it if you'd like. But again, thank you, Michael, and thank you to our Lighthouse partners as well.